So, I had this itch to explore the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. You know, the place famous for its creepy stories and ghostly legends. I figured why not go camping there alone and see if the stories were true. I packed up my gear and drove out there, excitement and a bit of nerves bubbling up inside me. I found this spot deep in the woods, far from the beaten path. The place was exactly like you'd imagine: thick woods, dark shadows, and a general vibe that something might be lurking just out of sight. I set up my tent and got a small fire going. As the night started to fall, the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. It felt like the forest was closing in. While I was fiddling with the fire, I noticed another campsite not too far away. This guy was setting up his tent, and he had this weird, vacant look on his face. When he noticed me, he gave me a cold stare before ducking inside his tent. I tried not to think too much of it. It's a big forest, and people are bound to be a little strange, right? Nighttime in the Pine Barrens was like nothing I'd ever experienced. The usual night noises, crickets, the wind rustling through the trees, were gone. Instead, there was this oppressive silence that just felt heavy. I tried to ignore it and get some sleep, but then I started hearing this weird thumping noise. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was tapping a drum or something nearby. I unzipped my tent and shone my flashlight outside, but the darkness was so thick it barely cut through. The thumping stopped as soon as I looked outside, leaving me feeling even more uneasy. I tried to convince myself it was probably just an animal or some natural phenomenon. Still, my imagination was running wild, and sleep was nowhere in sight. The thumping noise kept coming back, and it sounded like it was getting closer. Each time, it seemed to circle my tent, and I could hear it moving around outside. My heart was racing, and I was getting seriously freaked out. Finally, I decided I had to check it out. Every instinct told me to stay put, but my curiosity and my fear got the better of me. I stepped outside into the darkness, flashlight in hand, trying to see what was going on. The beam of light barely reached a few feet in front of me, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift in the gloom. I turned my gaze toward the neighboring campsite. The guy's tent was now eerily quiet and still. Something about it just didn't sit right with me, and the fear I felt was nearly suffocating. With my heart pounding, I decided I had to find out what was going on at the other campsite. As I approached, the forest seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. I finally reached the guy's campsite, and what I saw will haunt me forever. The man was sitting by the fire, which was barely glowing now. His face was blank, almost like he was in a trance. Lying next to him was the lifeless body of a young girl. Her clothes were torn, and her body was horribly mutilated. Her breasts had been cut off, and there were deep gashes all over her. Next to her was a cat with its eyes gouged out, but it was still alive, mewing in a way that was absolutely chilling. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was so horrified I could barely move. I stumbled back to my tent, my mind spinning with the horror of what I'd just seen. I packed up my stuff as fast as I could, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The forest seemed to close in around me, every shadow looking like it might be hiding something else terrifying. When I reached the police station, I told them everything. The officers seemed skeptical but sent out a search party. They only found the cat, which was still alive but died under mysterious circumstances later at the station. The man and the girl had vanished without a trace, and the whole situation remained a chilling mystery. That night in the Pine Barrens left a mark on me that I'll never shake. The image of the girl, the man's vacant stare, and the eyeless cat haunt my dreams. Every time I think about that night, the fear and horror come rushing back, reminding me that some places are best left unexplored. So, I'd always heard about the Naches Trace in Mississippi being this beautiful historic trail. People raved about the stunning views and the rich history, but I'd also heard whispers of something a little darker, lurking in the woods. I decided to go for a weekend camping trip to see if the rumors were true. When I got there, it was like stepping into a postcard. The forest was lush and green, and the stream nearby gurgled softly, adding to the peaceful vibe. I set up my tent near the stream, feeling pretty content. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, it was perfect. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, I started feeling a little uneasy. You know that feeling when everything is too quiet? It was like the forest was holding its breath. Nightfall came, and with it, a thick silence. It wasn't the usual nighttime sounds I was used to. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just this oppressive quiet that felt almost heavy. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Around midnight, I started hearing this weird chanting. It wasn't loud at first, just this low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to drift through the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and started looking around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The beam barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow looked like it was moving. It felt like the forest was alive, and whatever was out there didn't want me to find it. The chanting got louder as I went deeper into the woods. The darkness was so thick, it felt like I was walking through a living, breathing thing. Every step I took, the trees seemed to close in on me, and the air grew colder. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. My flashlight flickered a few times, and then, bam, the scene was right there in front of me. An old woman stood in the middle of the clearing. Her clothes were ragged, and her hair was a wild, tangled mess. Her eyes had this eerie glow to them that made my blood run cold. She was chanting in this harsh, guttural language that I couldn't understand, and it felt like the air was vibrating with dark energy. But the worst part? She was pulling out clumps of her own hair and shoving them into her mouth. She chewed with this frenzied intensity, like she was starving. Her eyes were wide and almost hypnotic, and the whole thing felt like a scene from a twisted fairy tale. I was frozen in place, unable to look away. I finally managed to tear myself away and run back to my campsite. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking as I packed up my gear. Every little sound in the forest made me jump, and it felt like the darkness was closing in around me. I packed everything as fast as I could, my mind racing with the images of what I'd just seen. At the police station, I tried to explain what happened. The officers were polite but clearly skeptical, brushing it off as a bad dream or an overactive imagination. They sent out a search party, but they found nothing. No sign of the woman, no trace of the ritual. It was like the whole thing had evaporated into thin air. Leaving the Naches Trace felt like a massive relief, but the memory of that night stuck with me. The image of the woman, her ritual, and the dark energy that surrounded her are burned into my mind. I can't shake the feeling that something malevolent is still out there, lurking in the shadows. I try to avoid dark forests now, and the thought of something sinister hiding just out of sight always makes my skin crawl. The Naches Trace was beautiful, sure, but the darkness I encountered there is something I'll never forget. The Red River Gorge in Kentucky is known for its incredible views and rock formations. My friends and I were pumped about our weekend camping trip there. We thought it'd be the perfect chance to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and soak up some nature. When we arrived, the gorge was even more amazing than we'd imagined. The cliffs were towering and majestic, and the forest was a vibrant green. We set up our camp with a fantastic view of the cliffs and spent the evening chilling around the campfire. The stars were out, the weather was perfect, and everything seemed great. But as night fell, things started to get a little weird. As soon as darkness hit, it was like the forest went mute. The usual night sounds were gone. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just this heavy, eerie silence that felt like it was pressing in on us. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's about to go terribly wrong. Then, out of nowhere, we started hearing these blood-curdling screams. They were desperate and haunting, echoing through the trees and bouncing off the cliffs. It was like someone, or something, was in serious distress. The screams seemed to come from every direction, and it was impossible to figure out where they were coming from. We huddled together by the fire, our faces pale and our hearts racing. We decided to check it out, despite being scared out of our minds. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the woods. The beams of our flashlights cut through the darkness, but the forest was so dense that it felt like we were walking through a living nightmare. The shadows danced around us, and every little noise made us jump. We followed the direction of the screams, but the deeper we went, the creepier it got. We kept seeing shapes out of the corner of our eyes, but whenever we turned to look, there was nothing there. The forest felt alive with a dark, oppressive energy, and it was hard to tell what was real and what was just our imaginations running wild. When morning finally came, we were exhausted and on edge. We decided to check around our campsite for any clues. That's when we found something that made our skin crawl. Strange symbols burned into the ground. The symbols were arranged in these bizarre, ritualistic patterns, and they gave off an unsettling vibe. We talked to a local who told us that the Red River Gorge had a dark history. There were tales of settlers disappearing mysteriously and restless spirits haunting the forest. The thought that we might have stumbled into something supernatural was almost too much to handle. The symbols seemed to confirm that we had come across something really sinister. We packed up and left the Red River Gorge as quickly as we could. The experience left us all shaken, and the fear from that night stayed with us long after we left. The screams, the creepy symbols, and the feeling of being watched were like shadows that followed us home. Even now, thinking back to that weekend, it feels like a vivid nightmare. We all had nightmares, and the sense that something malevolent might still be lurking in the forest never really went away. The Red River Gorge, with its incredible beauty and hidden horrors, is a place I'll never forget.